Okay, so as we move forward in these 9-4 notes, you're going to notice that we are going to start needing to use what we learned in section 9-3. So 9-3, we had to simplify our radicals. 9-4, so far we've had perfect squares or negative numbers like -4 that we have not been able to take the square root of. But as we're moving on, you're going to notice we need to use those skills that we learned in section 9-3 to simplify our square roots. So let's look at number 5. We have x squared equals 40. Remember, our instructions on this page are to solve each equation. So that means get the variable by itself. In 5, we want to get x by itself. So we don't like it that it's x squared. We want it to just be x. So we're going to take the square root of both sides because it's an equation. So what we do to one side, we must do to the other side. Okay. Just like before, the square root and the squared cancel each other out. So I'm going to write this as x equals, is 40 a perfect square? No, it is not. So right now, we're just going to keep it as the square root of 40. This is where we're going to go to what we did in 9-3 to try to simplify this. So if we have the square root of 40, try to think of a perfect square that's in the number 40. The one that's really sticking out to me is 4, because 4 times 10 is 40. And 4 is a perfect square because if I take the square root of 4, I just get 2. So that means the square root of 40 can be simplified as 2 square root of 10. But remember how above we were getting 2 answers for our problems? We were getting a positive number and a negative number. The same thing is going to happen here. So what I want you to be aware of is anytime you draw in the square root on your problem, you need to add a plus or minus sign out front of your radical. That takes into consideration what we did in number 3 where we get 6 and -6 because we could write that as x equals plus or minus 6. That's actually 2 answers. That means x is positive 6 and x is -6. So in our problem number 5 here, we get that x equals a positive 2 square root of 10. But we also know from this sign here that x is going to equal a -2 square root of 10. Now remember, 2 square root of 10 was just our simplified version of the square root of 40. But when we draw in that square root, right here, when we draw in that square root, that means we have to put a plus or minus sign out front. Because a -2 square root of 10 times a -2 square root of 10 gets us a positive 40. Because a negative times a negative is a positive. If you remember nothing else from this section, hopefully you remember that a negative times a negative is a positive. Okay, so our 2 answers to this problem are x equals positive and -2 square root of 10. As you've noticed, a lot of times we are going to get 2 answers for a lot of these problems. Alrighty, moving on to number 6. We have b squared equals 48. I bet you know what to do here. Let's take the square root of both sides. So we get b equals, but we drew in that square root, right? So because we drew in that square root, we're going to write plus or minus the square root of 48. So off to the side here, let's think about 48. We want to think about if there are any perfect squares in 48. So I know 4 times something is going to be 48, right? 48 divided by 4 is 12. You might also be thinking 16 is a perfect square, and 16 times 3 is 48. You're going to get the same answer either way if you break this set down into square root of 48 as 4 times 12 or 16 times 3. If you do 16 times 3, what is the square root of 16? 4. So you get 4 square root of 3 right away. But if you broke it down into 4 times 12, and you go to take the square root of both of those, you might notice that 12 actually still has a 4 in it. So it's 4 times 3. So you end up with the square root of 4 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. The square root of 4 is 2 times 2 square root of 3, which is 4 square root of 3. So the one on the right is a longer way to get the same answer as the one on the left. So one word of advice for you is always try to think of the biggest perfect square in the number because it will save you the most steps in the long run. But either way, the square root of 48 can be simplified to 4 square root of 3. But what have we learned so far in this section? A negative times a negative is a positive, right? So b equals plus or minus 4 square root of 3. You can write your answers like this. If you don't like that, you can write them how I've been writing them this whole time. So 4 square root of 3, negative 4 square root of 3. Those both mean exactly the same thing.